Cain, Abel, Seth, three names intertwined with the opening chapters of the Bible. The sons of Adam and Eve are recounted through their names, their actions, and their destinies. We know Cain killed Abel. We know Seth was born afterward to replace the lost brother. We know how long they lived, who they begat, and how their lineage stretched all the way to Noah. But what about the daughters of Adam and Eve, Genesis? The foundational book of the entire Bible says nothing about them. Not a single name, not a single mention, not a single hint that they ever existed in the story. This is strange, if not outright peculiar, because Genesis is an extraordinarily detailed text. It records the age of each figure, the years they lived before and after having children, and even recounts specific journeys, events, and words spoken in a text so meticulous. The complete silence about the first daughters of humanity is impossible to ignore. We are talking about the dawn of time when the entire world consisted of one family, no nations, no peoples, no laws governing marriage, organization, or lineage. In that world, for humanity to continue, Adam and Eve clearly had to have daughters. Clearly, Cain and Seth, and perhaps Abel, had to have spouses to produce the next generation. Yet, the text chooses silence. Why was this a deliberate choice? A subtle concealment to reinforce a patriarchal order? Because if the daughters of Adam, the first mothers of humanity, were named, they would also carry the power of creation, the power of continuation. But by omitting them, the story becomes a one-way stream, where men are the center, the ones chosen by God, the ones recorded and remembered. It's not hard to see across thousands of years of religious history. Women often appear as background, as supporters, as symbols, but rarely as independent subjects. And that begins on the very first page of the Bible. But not all ancient texts are silent. There is one book excluded from the canonical Bible that dared to write the names of those forgotten daughters. A book once considered sacred in ancient Jewish tradition, cherished in Ethiopian Christian communities. A book that, because of those very lines, was deemed dangerous. Their names are Awan, Azura, Luluwa, and their story awaits to be told. In the light of truth, there is a book not found in the canonical Bible, but once regarded as holy by ancient peoples, an ancient text, written in Hebrew, passed down in Jewish tradition, and revered as the Word of God in the Ethiopian Church for thousands of years. That book is called the Book of Jubilees, or Little Genesis, a fuller, more detailed version of the story of origins. While Genesis remains silent, Jubilees speaks. While Genesis never mentions the daughters of Adam and Eve, Jubilees boldly names them Awan, Azura, Luluwa, not as faint symbols, not as shadows on the margins. They are recorded in the lineage, given a place in human history, and even identified as the first to enter marriage, giving birth to the next generation after Adam. Jubilees 4:1-9 recounts that Cain married Awan, his twin sister. Later, Seth married Azura, also his sister from the same parents, and Luluwa, the first daughter, born alongside Abel, was intended to be Abel's wife before he was killed. Names that seem small, but they were the sole source from which humanity multiplied in those early days. Perhaps it is precisely because of these details, truths that transcend modern moral boundaries, that the Book of Jubilees was pushed out of the light. A text that dared to confront a difficult issue, incest, was unavoidable if humanity began with a single couple. Jubilees is not theologically convenient for later perspectives, but it is painfully logical when viewed through the lens of history and biology. And like all truths deemed dangerous, Jubilees was cast aside. Its copies gradually disappeared from the West. It survived only in a few ancient manuscripts in Ethiopia, among small communities who believed that not all truths are easy to hear, but the truth is something that must be known. Awan, Azura, Luluwa, not just the names of daughters, they are the last remaining traces of half of humanity's history, erased from our collective memory. And Jubilees, the forbidden book, is the key to unlocking that door once more. From the very first pages of the Old Testament to the later books of history, prophecy, and poetry, the Bible consistently emphasizes men: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, David. They are the ones named, the ones who receive the word, the ones who make covenants, the ones chosen to father nations. But if we look closely at the structure of these texts, one truth becomes clear: women are not absent. They are simply obscured by the hands of those who held the power to write. The Bible was transmitted through generations by word of mouth before being written down, and those who wrote it were, for the most part, men living in patriarchal societies where a woman's value was often measured by her role as wife, mother, or vessel for lineage. Thus, in the very act of choosing which stories to tell and how to tell them, a bias was already embedded. Undeniable. In Genesis, we know clearly that Cain was the first farmer, Abel was a shepherd, Seth was the holy line favored by God. But who were their wives? The women who gave birth to the next generations, who were they? What were their names? What did they endure? That silence is not because they didn't exist. It was a deliberate choice. This choice is not unique to the Bible. It echoes throughout human history. Who gets recorded? Who is allowed a name in the official lineage? Who is permitted a voice in collective memory? History is never a neutral mirror. It is a lens, shaped and polished to reflect the world through the perspective of those who wield the pen. So when a book like Jubilees appears with names like Awan, Azura, Luluwa, names thought to be forgotten, it is not merely a supplement to a deficient text. It is an act of resistance against the bias of recorded history. It is a declaration that women were there from the very beginning, not on the margins, but at the center, not as secondary characters, but as bearers of life. And if we don't see them in the canonical Bible, it may not be because they were unimportant. It may be because someone chose not to mention them anymore. In the canonical Bible, the opening chapters of Genesis establish a sacred order. God creates Adam, then Eve. They give birth to Cain, Abel, then Seth. The lineage continues from there, gradually spreading across the earth. But there is a glaring gap, a hole in the narrative that any serious reader cannot miss. How did humanity multiply when only one family is described? Genesis does not answer. It remains silent. But the Book of Jubilees, an ancient text once considered sacred in many Jewish and early Christian communities, chooses to speak clearly. In chapter 4, Jubilees not only names the daughters of Adam and Eve Awan, Azura, Luluwa, but also describes their marriages to their own brothers. Cain married Awan, Seth married Azura, and Luluwa was betrothed to Abel before his death. In modern times, this can be shocking. Marriage between siblings is not only forbidden, but seen as immoral, even abhorrent. But if we step back to the primordial era, when humanity consisted of just two people, the truth is there was no other option. Without marriages between siblings, humanity could not have continued. A difficult truth to accept, but undeniable. Perhaps for this reason, later editors chose to omit these details. They preserved the descriptions of the male lineage and left out the complex relationships that are not easily explained in theological or moral terms. Genesis became a clean text, avoiding conflict with the ethical principles forming in ancient societies. Meanwhile, Jubilees, more honest and explicit, was pushed out of the canon. The omitted lines are not mere trivia. They are the key to understanding human origins, the nature of laws, and how humanity grappled with its own limitations. In a world without laws, what was lawful was not what was written, but what was necessary for life to continue. Jubilees touched on this, and for that reason, it was excluded. But in that exclusion, we see something profound. What is hidden often forces us to confront ourselves not in the light of ideals, but in the raw truth of our beginnings. We grow up with an image. The Bible is revelation, absolute truth, a voice beyond doubt. But have we ever asked who told this truth, whose hand wrote it, and why are there details so clear and cohesive, yet also gaps that haunt us? The Bible, as we have it today, is not a seamless block dropped from heaven. It is a collection of books, copied by hand over centuries, edited, compiled, curated through theological councils amid debates steeped in divine and political agendas. And what remains, what was chosen to stay, was not kept solely because it was true, but also because it was fitting. Fitting for what? For an emerging system of belief, for a social order centered on male authority, for a storytelling approach that excluded what was not easily controlled. And when we look back, we see women are one of the greatest gaps left in the text. From Eve, who appears only as a part of Adam's body, to the wives of Cain, Seth, and the mothers of the patriarchs. They are all identified by role, not by name. They exist to bear children, to continue the lineage, but their stories are absent. No emotions, no struggles, no soul. They are like shadows passing through, not real people. Is this coincidence, or is it the result of a gaze, a perspective already shaped by the hands of the storytellers, the priests, the scholars, and the scribes? Have we been reading the Bible not with our own eyes, but through a lens already painted with color? And if the truth lies in what was left out, then it's time we pause, return to those gaps, and ask who was forgotten. Why were they not mentioned? And if they were women, the first humans who brought life to this earth, what conscience allows us to remain silent? Because sometimes believing in the Bible doesn't mean believing in every word, but believing that God can still speak through what was hidden. And we must have the courage to listen. The gates of Eden closed behind them. No more angels to walk beside them. No more footsteps of God echoing in the evening breeze. Adam and Eve. The first two humans now stood in a wholly different world. A world no longer radiant with innocence. No longer shielded by the sacred garden. No longer centered on the tree of life to sustain them forever. Only barren soil, thorns, and a curse hanging in every breath. Sin did not just separate them from God, it separated them from each other. The primal love was now replaced by duty. The man must toil in sweat to earn his bread. The woman must bear children in pain. Every rhythm of life, every moment of existence, bore the mark of what was lost. The dream of a paradise where humanity lived in peace with the Creator and all creation was now only a memory. But strangely, it was in that desolation that life began. From the dust, they built a home. From pain, Eve bore her first child, Cain, then Abel, then other children the Bible does not name. Each child born was a testament. The dream was not entirely dead. Humanity, though fallen, still carried the breath of the Creator, and their lineage would continue. Yet that life was no longer pure as before. With sin, death also crept into humanity. Cain killed Abel, the first death not ordained by God, but caused by human hands. The pain of a mother in childbirth was now multiplied 1,000-fold as she buried the child she bore and watched another become a murderer. Eden was not just lost, it was reversed. And in that tragic scene, a quiet question arises: who will redeem this lineage? Who will preserve the memory of the days of innocence? Who will retell the story of the beginning so that humanity is not merely the consequence of sin, but also the hope for restoration? Genesis begins in light, but quickly descends into darkness. And it is in that darkness that names like Awan, Azura, Luluwa are mentioned like fragile rays of light lingering after Eden. Women who carried pain, sacrifice, and a silent mission to give birth anew to a humanity that had lost itself. In Genesis, when Eve gave birth to Cain, she declared, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." Cain was the firstborn, the first child born of humanity. But the Bible does not clarify when Cain was born. Was he alone? Was he the only child of that birth? Or was there a daughter, twin to him, born at the same time, from the same womb? The answer lies not in Genesis, but in texts outside the Bible, specifically in ancient Jewish tradition, the Midrash, and especially the Book of Jubilees. These texts state clearly Cain was born a twin with a daughter named Luluwa, and Abel also had a twin sister, Aklia, or sometimes also called Luluwa, depending on the translation. Some traditions hold that Luluwa was betrothed to Abel, and Cain, out of jealousy, killed his brother to claim her. If these oral traditions and ancient texts are true, then the first marriage in human history was between siblings, between brother and sister, born of the same parents. A shocking, deeply controversial truth when viewed through the lens of modern ethics, but in the context of a world with only one family, it was the only option for humanity to continue. Notably, Jubilees does not shy away from this detail. On the contrary, it records it plainly. Cain married his sister Awan. There is no condemnation, no punishment, no emphasis on sin, because there was no Mosaic law then, no commandments against incest. Everything was just beginning, and life, in some way, was placed above all else. Luluwa, born alongside Cain, is not just a sister, but a symbol of a primordial stage of humanity, where moral boundaries were yet to be established, a time when every human was an irreplaceable link in the chain of continuing life. The story of Luluwa places us before a hard truth to swallow. We, humanity today, may have been born from a connection that we now consider taboo, and that does not make our ancestors impure. On the contrary, it shows they lived, loved, and chose in a barren wilderness to preserve life. So who was Luluwa? Was she Cain's twin sister, Abel's promised wife? The cause of the first murder in history, or simply a woman erased from the biblical story because her presence evoked a past too complex to acknowledge? Genesis, the foundational book of the Bible, seems to have no room for the daughters of Adam and Eve. We read of Cain, Abel, then Seth, then Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, a chain of men stretching from chapter to chapter, as if history were written by only half the world. In Genesis 5:4, there is one vague line: Adam lived 800 years after he begat Seth, and he had other sons and daughters. But it is a fleeting note, no names, no stories, no roles. They are just an invisible crowd on the sidelines of the main narrative. In contrast, the Book of Jubilees, an ancient text once considered sacred in Judaism and early Christianity, dared to do what Genesis did not name them. In Jubilees 4:9-14, the daughters of Adam and Eve are recorded clearly. One by one, Awan, Cain's wife, Azura, Seth's wife, and Luluwa, tied to both Cain and Abel in a tangled web of kinship, not just names. They are linked to relationships, to pivotal moments in humanity's survival. Awan was not merely a sister. She was the first wife recorded in human history, the one who stood by Cain after the tragedy of killing his brother. Azura was the mother of Enoch, whom the Bible notes as the first to call upon the name of the Lord after the moral collapse following Cain. And Luluwa, though her role is less clear in every text, still emerges as a key figure in the earliest dynamics of love, jealousy, and death. Naming is not just an act of remembrance. In the ancient world, to be named was to be recognized as existing. Genesis let them fade into oblivion. Jubilees called them back from the darkness. In an era when women were undervalued and power rested in the hands of male lineages, recording women's names in a sacred text was a revolutionary act. And that is precisely why Jubilees became dangerous. It disrupted the linear structure of history, where men pass down the lineage, and women are mere vessels. It reminds us that the first women were not shadows behind Adam and his sons. They were the lifeblood, the links, the silent witnesses to a humanity just beginning to bloom. If we only read Genesis, we would never know who they were. But Jubilees whispers what history tried to hide. And if we listen long enough, we will hear the voices of those forgotten still echoing through the long night of humanity. We often approach the Bible through the lens of modern people with clear ethical systems, transparent laws, and established moral boundaries. But when we return to the dawn of humanity, where there was only one family, no nations, no laws, no traditions, the boundaries we see as inviolable did not yet exist. In the time of Adam and Eve, marriage was not defined by documents, ceremonies, or authorities. It was a time when survival was the sole priority. For humanity to continue, their children, both sons and daughters, had to marry each other, not because they sought to defy morality, but because there was no other choice. Genesis does not directly address sibling marriage, but neither does it condemn it, when it states that Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, then lists the lineage from Cain, Seth. The Bible implicitly acknowledges that the next generation came from those very siblings. If not, where did humanity come from? Jubilees, in contrast, does not avoid the detail. Jubilees 4 explicitly recounts that Cain married Awan. Seth married Azura, sisters born of the same parents. There is no condemnation, no punishment, only the cold, necessary truth. Humanity was born from the first bonds of kinship. It was not until thousands of years later, when societies grew complex, populations expanded, and religion became an organized system, that the Mosaic law was given, prohibiting incestuous relationships. That does not make the first marriages sinful. It only reflects that in each era, what is lawful is shaped by the demands of survival. We cannot apply today's laws to judge those who lived at the dawn. To do so is to judge our ancestors by a framework they never knew. They had no law books, no priests, no traditions, only fear, responsibility, and a faint belief that life must go on. So instead of condemning, let us seek to understand to see that what we today call right is sometimes just a product of time. And at the start of history, humans loved, chose, connected not for morality, but for survival, and perhaps for hope. In any lineage, people proudly recount their ancestors with resounding names, fathers who pioneered lands, passed down legacies, were chosen by God. But how many speak of the mothers, the women who birthed those generations, nurtured them with blood and tears, then quietly vanished from the official record? The daughters of Adam, the first women on earth, were not just the wives of Cain and Seth. They were the first mothers of humanity. From their wombs, lineages began. From their breath, the first tribes took shape. Every nation, every civilization, great or fallen, can trace its roots back to a nameless mother in the Bible: Awan, Azura. Luluwa names found only in the Book of Jubilees are not symbols. They are flesh and blood. They were women who walked out of Eden with their parents, lived in the wilderness, bore children in pain, built homes with bare hands in a land with no paths. They did not just help humanity continue, they carried within them a forgotten spiritual memory, a memory of a world without laws, without temples, without systems, yet still full of the sacred. It is a paradox that the Bible, which cherishes life, lets those who gave life fade into silence. The unavoidable question is why? Because they were women, because their roles did not fit the emerging patriarchal order, or because mentioning them also meant acknowledging marriages that later theology struggled to accept. That silence is not harmless. When we do not speak of them, we let their legacy slip away. When the daughters of Adam are erased from memory, half of humanity's soul is forgotten. We cannot fully understand the story of creation without seeing the mothers, and we cannot fully grasp God's intent without acknowledging those who bore both the righteous and the rebellious. That bloodline thought to be buried still flows in us, in history, in the aspirations for justice, motherhood, and restoration. They do not need altars to be remembered. They only need to be named once more, and this time, not forgotten. History is always told by those who survive, but survivors are not always just. They record what they see, or rather, what they want to be seen and continued. In the case of the Bible, the story of creation and humanity's lineage was written, compiled, and preserved by a specific group, the descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. Seth is a symbol of holiness, the one given by God to replace Abel. As Genesis 4:25 declares, from him, the righteous lineage continued through Enoch, then Noah, then Abraham, and ultimately to the nation of Israel. For this reason, the biblical texts, historically speaking, are the story told from a single branch of humanity, the line of Seth. But Adam and Eve did not have only one son. Before Seth came Cain, the murderer of his brother, but also the father of artisans, cities, music, and craftsmanship. And between them, there were daughters who, as the Book of Jubilees records, became wives, mothers, and the foundation of the earliest communities. They did not vanish. They simply did not belong to the story chosen to be preserved. If the descendants of Seth wrote this history, it is no surprise that the descendants of others, especially from Cain's line, were portrayed as symbols of the fall. But were they truly wholly sinful? Were all of Cain's descendants corrupt, and all of Seth's line righteous? Or was this a division created to reinforce the legitimacy of a chosen lineage? Likewise, the daughters, though they undoubtedly existed, had no voice, for they left no texts, led no tribes, and received no promises. They became a void, and in that void, a part of the truth was buried. The question is not who survived, but rather who was given the right to write the story. And when a book like Jubilees emerges, bringing back figures cast out of the light, it does more than add to the narrative. It challenges the authority of record-keeping. It forces us to look again. How many stories were cut away? How many people were forgotten simply because they did not fit the ideal mold? History is a curated truth, and the Bible, though holy, is still told through human hands. So it is time we listen to the voices that were silenced, those who did not write but lived, those not chosen, yet still part of the plan of creation. We often think Eden was the only thing lost after the original sin, a sacred garden where God and humanity dwelt in harmony. But in truth, Eden was not the only thing that vanished. When the gates of the garden closed, it was not just paradise locked away. It was the primal memory within humanity that began to fade from within. And among those lost memories is one of the most profound and painful, the memory of the first women, those who left Eden alongside Adam, those who endured the first birth pangs, not in a hospital, not with anesthesia, not under a roof, but amidst rocks, wilderness, and the trembling hands of a new mother. They gave birth to the first humans of humanity and then vanished from the pages. Genesis speaks of the men, of Cain, of Abel, of Seth, of Noah, of those who built cities, constructed arks, made covenants, and raised altars. But what of Awan, the first wife of Cain, Azura, who gave birth to Enoch, Luluwa, who was betrothed to Abel? They not only lack their own chapters, they lack even a name in the canonical Bible. That silence is not accidental. It is a systematic forgetting, a choice in recording, where women were preserved only if their stories served a religious or lineage purpose. So every time we read Genesis and do not see their names, we contribute to that forgetting. Every page turned, where only men speak, decide, and appear, is a page of history where half of humanity is silenced. And that pain is not theirs alone. It belongs to all of humanity. For if women are forgotten, then half of the human soul, the tender, life-giving, nurturing part, is stripped away. Eden may be closed, but the true loss is when we no longer remember those who stepped out of the garden with Adam, not with sin, but with life. And if today we seek to reclaim Eden, not just as a place, but as a state of primal purity, then we must begin by calling back the names that were forgotten. For that is kape, the only way humanity can be restored, not just in body, but in soul, not just the male, but the female, not just history, but memory. The Book of Jubilees, in chapter 4, records what Genesis avoids humanity multiplied not by miracles, but through the first marriages between siblings. This may shock modern readers, but in the context of the primordial era, when humanity consisted of a single family, it was the only way for life to continue. Jubilees 4:9 writes, Cain married his sister Awan, and she bore him a son named Enoch. This is the first time in any ancient text that a wife of Cain is named. Awan, not a symbol, not a metaphor, but a specific person, a wife, a mother, the first to continue the line of life after the first murder in human history. A few lines later, the text mentions Abel, who was also betrothed to his sister Luluwa, though his early death prevented this marriage. Finally, Seth, described as the righteous one, born to replace Abel, married Azura, his sister from the same parents, and from them came Enoch, a figure Genesis 4:26 notes as the one when men began to call upon the name of the Lord. 3 couples, 3 paths stretching from Eden into the world. Without them, There would be no Noah, no Abraham, no Israel, no us. These marriages were the initial foundation, the pillars of life, the silent but irreplaceable undercurrents of human history. The canonical Bible does not deny them, it simply does not mention them. But that very silence makes the lines in Jubilees all the more vital. They fill a gap we were never taught to confront, not to glorify or endorse sibling marriage, but to understand at the beginning, life mattered more than the clarity of law. Names like Awan, Azura, Luluwa, perhaps erased from the canonical text, still live in ancient lines, in buried theological memory, and in our very flesh as descendants of courageous, painful, and necessary choices. And when we call their names today, we are saying every thread of life deserves to be remembered, even those threads that come from what we hesitate most to face the truth about our origins. Awan, a name rarely found on the margins of the canonical Bible. A woman, not a symbol, not a vague gender, but a specific individual, a sister, the first wife of Cain, and one of the first women born of Adam and Eve. In the Book of Jubilees, Chapter 4, Awan appears not just as a name, but as a knot in the entire first tragedy of humanity. For if Cain was the first murderer, Abel the first victim, then Awan was the first witness to the pain of loss and sin. She not only lost a brother who, in some ancient texts, was promised to be her husband, but also lost her true husband, as Cain went from a man to an exile bearing God's mark of curse. Imagine Awan's plight, the first woman to choose to love a man marked as a murderer, the only wife of a man cursed by God, wandering to the land of Nod, the mother who bore the first child outside Eden, Enoch, in loneliness and shame that no text bothers to mention. No line in Genesis tells us that Awan wept. No words describe her reaction as she witnessed Cain kill Abel. No story recounts the look in her eyes as she gazed at her husband after the deed. She is present, but invisible. Like so many other women in the Bible, they exist in life, but are absent in memory. She was not given a chance to question, not allowed to justify, not defended. Cain's story is told as a symbol of sin and punishment, but Awan's story, the woman who stood between those two men, who witnessed the first family tragedy, is silenced. She may have been torn apart, she may have pleaded, she may have been mute, but no one knows, because no one gave her a voice. And so, the name Awan, though it appears in Jubilees, has been erased from collective memory for thousands of years. Today, when we call her name, we are not writing a new chapter, but acknowledging an old one, that human history was built on women like Awan, forgotten, sidelined. But the true lifeblood that sustained the vital story of humanity. By naming her, we restore a voice to a part of history that was silenced. And by remembering her, we begin a process of healing, not just for the past, but for the way we have let silence become the norm. There are names tied to turning points in history. Enoch is one of them. In Genesis 4:26, we read a deeply sacred line. At that time, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. This was the first time humanity, after so much chaos and brokenness from Cain to Abel, returned to a sacred act calling on the name of God. Enoch, Adam's grandson, is the one who carries this meaning. But behind that grandson is a woman whose name the Bible never mentions. Azura, daughter of Adam, sister of Seth, and mother of Enoch, is left on the margins, as if her existence were not worth preserving. In Jubilees 4:13, Azura is named clearly. Seth married his sister Azura, and she bore Enoch. Yet in the canonical text, she is only a shadow, no name, no role, no recognition. We praise Enoch as the herald of a new era, an era of faith, of prayer, of turning back to God. But the one who bore him, who raised him, who passed on the first spiritual memory is not mentioned. If Seth is remembered as the milestone reconnecting the holy line, Azura is the silent soil that allowed those roots to take hold. This reflects a reality throughout biblical history. Men are remembered for their deeds. Women are omitted despite giving birth to those deeds. Azura did nothing grand in the eyes of posterity. She made no covenants, built no altars, founded no cities. She only bore Enoch, and that was enough to deserve remembrance. Yet she was forgotten. Naming Azura today is not just an act of restoring memory, but an affirmation of a deeper truth. Every act of faith has a mother behind it. Even if unrecorded, every step back to God has a woman who quietly kept the flame alive in the darkness. Azura is the image of countless women in history who carried life, nurtured generations, preserved the spiritual fire, but were never celebrated, not because they were not sacred, but because history chose to preserve the call of men and forget the breath of women. If Enoch was the first to call upon the name of the Lord, then Azura was the first to whisper that name in a mother's heart. She does not need to be glorified in books, but she deserves to be named at least by those who still believe that no faith begins without an embrace to cradle it from the start. The Bible is never a random text. Every line, every detail kept or omitted is the result of a long process of editing, shaped by theological, social, and sometimes political purposes. So when we notice the absence of Adam and Eve's daughters in Genesis, despite historical logic demanding their existence, the question is not why were they not mentioned, but who chose not to mention them. That silence is not an accidental gap. It is a choice, a deliberate silence. For while Genesis 5 meticulously lists the ages, lineages, and descendants of men from Adam to Noah, women almost entirely disappear. They are not named, have no stories, and have no roles beyond bearing sons. Life is recorded, but those who gave life are not. This raises a possibility. Could it be that the Bible's editors, though reverent toward God, carried the biases of their time? Did they believe that sacred roles should be assigned to men, those who built altars, made covenants, spoke with God, while women should remain quietly in the background, and thus the female links like Awan, Azura, Luluwa, though vital to sustaining humanity's lineage, were erased from sacred history, not because they did not exist, not because they were unimportant, but because their presence challenged the order the editors sought to uphold, an order in which men were the image of God, the chosen ones, the representatives of faith, in that order, acknowledging women with active roles as life givers, as the first to make choices became inconvenient, a detail that did not fit the Book of Jubilees. By naming these women, does not merely tell a different story, it exposes a crack in the structure of the old one. It shows that history is not just what was written, but also what was hidden. Perhaps it is time to ask, are we reading the Bible through eyes guided by light or by a shadow cast long ago? And if that shadow is one of bias, of gender prejudice, then calling back the names of Awan, Azura, Luluwa is not just restoring memory. It is the first act of justice for the generation after Eden. There are questions we avoid not because they are wrong, but because they are too true. One such question is, if there were no marriages between siblings, where did humanity come from? A question that seems shocking, even blasphemous, but unavoidable when we read the opening chapters of the Bible. Genesis tells us that Adam and Eve were the first couple, that they bore Cain, Abel, then Seth. Afterward, the lineage continues through generations, stretching to Noah, Abraham, and Israel. But the gap between those first three sons and the rest of humanity is a logical void. Who was Cain's wife? Who was the mother of Adam's grandchildren? The Bible does not answer, not a line, not a note, only a prolonged silence, as if by not mentioning it, the truth would vanish. But the truth does not vanish. It is only pushed to the margins. The Book of Jubilees bravely steps into that void. It writes Cain married Awan, his sister. Seth married Azura, also his sister from the same parents. And the first generation from Enoch to Enosh was born from marriages that today we call incest. Why is this not clarified in Genesis? Perhaps because it touches on moral boundaries that later generations were not ready to face. When the Bible was edited and standardized, societies had laws, clear ethical lines, and prohibitions against sibling marriage. Mentioning a beginning rooted in what is now considered taboo would have been awkward for theology, for teaching, and for the sacred image of humanity's ancestors. But the paradox is life once had to begin from what we now see as the ultimate boundary. What we abhor today was necessary yesterday. And if God allowed humanity to begin from a single family, then he also permitted, or at least did not prevent, those first sibling marriages. Perhaps Genesis's silence is not a denial of the truth, but a space for us to fill with a more mature understanding, an invitation to look back at the past, not with judgment, but with empathy that every beginning is full of paradox, full of tension, and sometimes full of things we must learn to accept. Without incest, there would be no humanity, a truth not easy to hear, but also one that makes us cherish more deeply the long journey humanity has traveled from a lonely family outside Eden to a world teeming with life today. When reading the Bible, people often seek clarity, order, and morality. But the truth is, the opening chapters of humanity were not written as a law code. They were written as a misty mirror, reflecting both light and shadow, both the sacred and realities that are hard to swallow. One such reality is that the beginning of life came from sibling bonds, a truth the canonical Bible chooses to silence, while Jubilees dares to name, while Genesis glosses over the presence of Adam and Eve's daughters with a vague sentence. Jubilees names them clearly: Awan, Azura, Luluwa, women who were not just the wives of Cain, Seth, or Abel, but the matriarchs of humanity, life multiplied through them, through marriages that today we would avoid, even condemn. So the question arises, is this a truth hidden because it does not align with modern ethics? Or perhaps we are looking in the wrong direction. Maybe what is happening here is not a concealed truth, but a mystery that requires a different perspective. Genesis does not deny what happened, it simply does not state it outright. Not to deceive, but to preserve a sacred space where readers do not merely receive information, but embark on a journey of reflection, discernment, and confrontation with themselves. For if we judge history by today's standards, our ancestors were transgressors. But if we see history as a journey, a progression from chaos to law, from disorder to order, then those first relationships were not wrong, but true in a way that unsettles us. Jubilees does not shy away from mentioning this. It is not meant to shock or spark debate. It simply says, this is how humanity began. Not perfect, not clean, but real. And because it is real, it is sacred. For in that fragility and imperfection, humanity did not turn away from life. They continued. They bore children, nurtured, loved in the barren land left by Eden. And perhaps that was God's intent, not to begin with an ideal society, but with real humans full of limits, yet full of the desire to live. Humans who, in their sin, still carried light, a history that, in its darkness, still held the possibility of restoration. That truth is not easy to accept, but not every mystery is meant to be explained. Some are only to be stood before in reverence, nodding in silence. Human history, as recorded in the Bible, is a stream guided by familiar names: Adam, Cain, Seth, Enoch, Noah, Abraham. Men who are mentioned, whose lines are traced, who receive covenants. But hidden behind those generations are invisible women who were present, who loved, who bore children, then were quietly erased from collective memory. Awan, the first wife in human history, standing between two men, one a murderer, one a victim. Azura, mother of Enoch, who led humanity back to prayer. Luluwa, the daughter forgotten amidst the bloodlines tangled between Cain and Abel. They are not just names found in Jubilees. They are the roots of humanity, the ones who kept the flame of life burning through the long night after Eden. Without them, there would be no multiplication. Without them, history would have no storytellers. Without them, the bloodline from Adam could not pass through the generations. But they were not told, or if they were, it was only in marginal texts, deemed dangerous, excluded from the canonical Bible as if their presence was something not to be mentioned. Was it because they were women? Was it because they were pieces that recalled sibling bonds that later theology found troubling, or simpler still, because history was written by men, and women, though present, were not allowed a voice. Whatever the reason, that forgetting created a profound loss, not just the absence of a few names, but the absence of half of humanity's soul, a half created from dust, born alongside life, but pushed to the margins for not fitting the mold. Now, as we recall those names, we are not merely restoring a piece of memory, we are restoring justice to spiritual history. For the first women do not need to be deified. They only need to be named as those who were real, who lived, who hurt, who loved, and who built this humanity alongside the men we so often recount. And when we retell the story of origins, if we speak only of one half, we have not told it rightly. Life has never been the product of one gender alone. It is always the result of union between Adam and Eve, between Cain and Awan, between Seth and Azura. And if we forget them, we do not just lose the truth, we lose ourselves. The story you have just heard may have happened thousands of years ago when the world was still empty, when life was just beginning, when humanity stepped out of Eden with empty hands and a heart full of wounds. But what is hidden in that story, the gaps, the erased names, the women unmentioned, still echoes in the way we remember and forget today. We live in a modern age, with access to knowledge, with a voice, with the ability to rewrite our own stories. But have you ever paused to ask, is there something in your life, in your memory, that has never been told? Is there a part of your soul, like Awan, like Azura, like Luluwa, that has lived, loved, hurt, but never been named? We are not just readers of history, we are continuing it, and in that journey, each of us carries a piece of collective memory, the things forgotten, the pieces that don't fit the common narrative, the spiritual turns that have no place in books. But that does not make them less sacred. On the contrary, it is their silence and hiddenness that demand the deepest contemplation. So after closing this video, please take a few moments in silence. You don't need to understand every detail. Just think of the women lost in the shadows of history, yet living in you, in your gratitude for your mother, your grandmother, your sisters, for the sacred feminine within your own soul. Write down one thing you want to remember, a name, a memory, a story you've heard but never retold. Do not let those souls continue to drift in silence. Do not let half the truth remain forgotten. If you feel touched by this story, it may be because you are not just a listener, but one called to retell for the generations to come, to retell for healing, to retell so that what was once cast aside may return to its rightful place in humanity's memory. Could it be that this story is coming alive again, not in the time of Eden, but in your heart, right now? Amen.